Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Okay, so today we will be taking the Culavedalla Sutta. This is Sutta number 44 in the middle-length Discourses, and it begins on page 396. So the sutta is called in Pali the Culavedalla Sutta. The word Chula means shorter or small, because there's two Vedalla suttas. Number 43 is the Mahavedalla, which means the longer Vedalla Sutta. The meaning of the word Vedalla, it's not exactly clear because it's nowhere really explained very well. But both of the Vedalla Suttas take place as a sequence of questions and answers between two disciples, rather than between the Buddha and somebody who's interrogating him. And so it seems to be a kind of series of almost miscellaneous questions and answers. And usually they touch on quite deep and rather technical issues in the Dhamma. Okay, so this shorter series of questions and answers, it actually features a Bhikkhuni as the chief responder. Whereas actually the only responder. Yeah, her name is Dhammadinna, and she was declared amongst all of the nuns, she was declared to be the nun who was the foremost in expounding the Dhamma. And so she must have given many other discourses which are not recorded and not preserved. If she's called the foremost of expounders, then she must have spoken many times. But this short, vague questions and answers sutta has come down as sort of the testament or testimony to her appointment in that position. And then the person that is speaking to her is a lay follower, a layman, whose name is Visakha. And the commentary gives a little background story, and it explains that Visakha had actually been the husband of Dhammadinna before Dhammadinna became a nun, when they were living the household life. So the commentary says that one day this man Visakha went to hear the Buddha give a discourse. And so while Visakha was listening to the Buddha give his discourse, he paid very close attention to the teaching. While the Buddha was explaining, he followed very closely the teaching, meditating on the teaching as the Buddha was giving it. And as a result, he went boom, boom, boom 3 times. And he reached the third stage of enlightenment, the stage of anagami. And one of the features or qualities of an anagami, a non-returner, is that he's completely eradicated what is called the fetter of sensual desire or sensual craving. And so after the discourse, he went back home, and he seemed very, very peaceful, but he kept some distance from his wife, Dhammadinna, and he seemed very calm and peaceful, but also quite cool. He didn't show the usual signs of affection towards his wife. And so she asked him, "Is anything wrong? Did I do anything to trouble you, to disturb you, to make you angry or unhappy?" And then Visakha said, "No, you've always been a very perfect wife, but there's this wandering teacher who's been teaching in the bamboo grove, and I went to listen to him speak. They call him the Buddha, the Enlightened One. And as I was listening to his teaching, I reached such a stage of attainment that I'm completely rid of all sensual desire. So then he said that if you want, I'll just give you your share of the family wealth, and you can go off and marry again, or you can continue to live with me in the house. We've just lived together as brother and sister, whatever you want. And then Dhammadinna asked whether the Buddha had women ordained disciples. And then Visakha said, yes, there are both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. And so then Dhammadinna said, is it possible for me to become a bhikkhuni? And then Visakha said, it seems so, but you have to go and ask yourself. And then she asked, if I wanted to become a bhikkhuni, would you give me permission? And he said, I'd be delighted to let you become ordained as a bhikkhuni. And so she went herself, she went to the bamboo grove, she asked the Buddha for permission to become a nun, the Buddha gave her permission, and then she got ordained as a bhikkhuni. I don't know why Visakha didn't. It would make sense. Now he's free, so he could have become ordained as a bhikkhu. I don't know why that didn't happen. Maybe he had some obligations to his parents. The commentary doesn't say anything about them having children, but if they had children, one would think that the mother should take the responsibility for bringing them up. So I don't know, but he remained as a householder, but she got ordained as a bhikkhuni, and then she went off after her ordination to practice meditation very diligently, and before long she attained arhatship. Then when she came back to stay at the bamboo grove, then her former husband, Visakha, sort of wanted to find out how far she's gone in her spiritual development. And so he thought of this, some very questions touching on some very deep, difficult matters in the Dhamma. And so he wanted to test her by asking her these questions. Okay, so now the sutta opens when the lay follower Visakha goes to the Bhikkhuni Dhammadinna. And now since he is a layperson, she is a bhikkhuni, so he pays homage to her. And then he sits down on the side, and then he starts to ask his questions. Okay, so now we're on page 396, and first question he asks, he calls her Aya, which means something like venerable lady. And then he uses a word in Pali. It's very difficult to translate exactly into English to find a satisfactory rendering. But the word is I think maybe they're in the back here. Oh, you have them? Okay. Where were they?
I have not tested yet, but it's judging from the smell that it's not dry.
Okay, Johnny found. Even though it's a foreign word or a Pali word, but it's a word which, in a sense you could say, touches on the most sensitive aspect of our existence. You know, the question, what are you? What am I? refer to as our identity. So the Pali word is Sakkaya, or Sakkaya, which is made up of the word Kaya, which means body. But it doesn't refer exclusively to the physical body, but it's the body in the sense of a collection of things. Just as we speak about a body of people when there's a group of people. And so the word body, usually we think of it as one thing, the physical body. But the word body can also suggest an assemblage, a collection, a conglomeration. So this is Kaya. Body is the sense of a conglomeration of things. And then it has the prefix sat, which means existing. So it's the existing body, which you can see why it's difficult to render into English. Some of the earlier translators used to render it as personality. In fact, I did also. But personality usually suggests something like one's character, one's group of character traits. But that's not really the meaning of Sakkaya. Sakkaya is the existing totality of what is a person. So here we use identity. What is your identity? And so the Buddha used this term very often, or quite often in his teaching, to indicate what is a person, or more broadly, what is a living being, a sentient being. And so Visakha is trying to test Dhammadinna to see how well she understands this important philosophical issue. So then Dhammadinna explains these 5 aggregates affected by clinging or subject to clinging are called identity by the Blessed One. That is, there's the material form. First I'll read, then I'll go through and explain. That is, the material form aggregate, subject to clinging, the feeling aggregate, subject to clinging, the perception aggregate, subject to clinging, the formations aggregate, subject to clinging, and the consciousness aggregate, subject to clinging. These 5 aggregates affected by clinging or subject to clinging are called identity by the Blessed One. Okay, so when we think about ourselves, about our identity, we usually take ourselves to be what we call a self, to have some kind of solid, substantial, enduring, permanent, real identity. And according to the Buddha, this is like the fundamental delusion or fundamental mistake in our way of thinking. And so the Buddha looks at the living being, the sentient being, and analyzes the living being into, let's say, 5 types of, maybe it's best to use the word functions, or 5 types of factors which function together in a unison. There are 5 types of factors which are mutually conditioning, very closely interrelated and interdependent. And because they function together in such close unison, because of our ignorance, lack of insight, we grasp upon them as being an existing, single, whole entity, which we take to be myself, my real identity. But the actual identity is this functioning, interrelated combination or assemblage of what are known as the 5 aggregates. And these are the 5 aggregates which are, the important point is that they are subject to upadana, to clinging or grasping. And so we have the 5 aggregates. I use the Pali words so you can get familiar with them, but I want to explain them. That's okay, I can use my hand. It all comes off. Okay, so of course the most obvious factor in our identity, the one that's immediately visible, is material form, what we call the body. But when we look deeply into the body, I know some of you have been with me for years, so you've gone through this again and again, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it. Okay, so what we call the body, it's actually, when the Buddha looks deeply into the nature of the body, he finds it to be a combination of the four material elements. So we have the earth element, which is the property of hardness or solidity. The water element, which is the property of liquidity, fluidity. And it's also said to have the function of cohesion, of binding together the particles of the earth element so that they don't scatter. Then there's the heat element, so we can experience in our own body that our body is always at some temperature, normally 98.6. If one gets a fever, we say the fire element or heat element escalates, and so we get the fever. And then there's the air element or wind element, that we see most obviously in and out breathing. But when we breathe in, then the blood absorbs the oxygen gets distributed to all of the cells of the body. The carbon dioxide, which is also part of the air element, gets expelled from the body at exhalation. And so we have these 4 primary elements that make up the aggregate of form. And then there are different types of secondary material formations that make up the aggregate of form. The most important of these are the matter that makes up the 5 sense faculties. So according to the Buddha's teaching, we have 5 physical sense faculties. Usually we identify them as the sense organs, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. But it's not the actual sense organ that is the sense faculty, but it's rather within the sense organ there's a special type of matter that is sensitive to the corresponding type of sense object. For example, within the physical eye, there's a subtle type of matter which is sensitive to color, light, shape. Maybe in terms of modern physiology, you could identify that with the cones and rods. If we have any medical doctors, please correct me. Any ophthalmologists here? Okay, within the ear, what we call the ear faculty, it's not this mushroom-shaped organ out here, but deep within there is a kind of substance which is sensitive to sound, which picks up vibrations in the air and turns them into sound. And similarly with the nose, again, it's not this little bumpy thing coming out here, but somewhere up here, maybe in this area, there's a subtle type of matter which picks up different types of gases and then turns them into odors. And then the tongue, maybe we call these the taste buds, flavor buds, that turns food objects into taste, or picks up the taste of foods that we eat. Okay, so all of this is included within the form aggregate. Then the feeling aggregate, usually we divide feeling into 3 types of feeling: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neutral feeling. And in English, the word feeling suggests something like emotions. But in Pali, the word Vedana has a much more specific sense. It refers not so much to emotion, but what I would call the felt quality of an experience. That is, when we experience anything, sometimes we'll experience it as pleasant. So on that occasion, we would say a pleasant feeling has arisen. On other occasions, we'll experience something and we get it has a painful effect on us. And so on that occasion, we have a painful feeling. But most of the time, there's not a particularly striking pleasant feeling, not a particularly striking painful feeling. So at that time we say that we're experiencing a neutral feeling, a feeling that's not painful, not pleasant. Okay, and then feeling arises through all 6 of the senses. So through the eye, we can have pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neutral feeling. Through the ear, through the nose, through the tongue, through the body, and with our thoughts in the mind. I could think of something pleasant, maybe a nice beach scene in the Bahamas, wind blowing through the palm trees, waves lapping up gently on the shore. I'm not seeing it, just thinking it with my mind, but when I think of it during this cold, snowy winter, then I get a pleasant feeling. If I think of the heater in my room breaking down, even though it hasn't broken down, but I just think of it, and then I get painful feeling. So all of these are things going on in the mind. Or if I imagine somebody yelling at me, blaming me, getting angry with me, again, it's imaginary, but painful feeling comes. Okay, so this is the feeling aggregate, all of these, this input of pleasure, pain, and neutral feelings. Then there is the perception aggregate. So what is the specific function of perception? We say the specific function of perception is to seize upon or to pick up on the distinctive quality of an object that is known or experienced. So it's perception that, we could say, selects distinguishing qualities. So if I meet a person for the first time, I've never seen that person before, so my mind will pick up certain features of that person, the way they brush the hair, the way they smile, color of the eyes, the way they dress, and so on. And so all of that goes into my image of that person. So all of this is the work of perception. And then if I see that person again, say I'm walking down the street, I pass that person, sometimes it just takes a split second of seeing that person, and immediately, quicker than I can even think about it, the mind will pick up the features of that person and sort of send it back to the memory bank of that first meeting with the person, and then I recognize, that's the person I met on that occasion. So this is the work of perception. First, it selects distinctive qualities or features of an object, of a situation, and then you could say very quickly it labels as a basis for identification. So it also has, on the one hand, it has a sensory aspect in that it relates directly to the sensory experience, and it also has a conceptualizing aspect in that it classifies, labels as a basis for identification. And then we have 6 types of perception, again based on the 6 senses. So there's perception of forms, perception of sounds, odors, tastes, felt sensations, and perception of ideas. Has anybody ate a fruit called durian? Who hasn't eaten the durian? Raise your hand.
Has not.
What?
Has not.
Not yet. So if you've never eaten the durian, then you have no idea what it tastes like. Okay, so there'll be a first time you taste the durian. People sometimes they don't like to eat it because it has a rather pungent odor. It smells a little bit like a mixture of onions and garlic. But it tastes like ice cream. And so if you've never eaten the durian, then when you smell it, you get a perception, this is a perception through the nose, and it's a repugnant perception. But then if you taste it, it has, at least for some of us, it has very delicious taste. So the next time you smell a durian, even though at one level it has a repugnant smell, but then it registers with the pleasant taste, and so then it will awaken the desire to taste it. Okay, the 4th aggregate is called, it's a very vague term, the Sankhara Khanda, which means the aggregate of, the word Sankhara can have many meanings, but here it has the meaning of especially volitional activities. That is, states of volition, intention, purpose that arise in the mind and that motivate action. Sometimes they'll motivate bodily action or verbal action, but sometimes they'll just take the form of an evaluation of a situation and some kind of intention with regard to that situation. And so the Buddhist texts use the Sankhara aggregate, something like an umbrella term, or it's a kind of big, all-inclusive category to put all the mental factors that don't fit into the other aggregates. So things like greed, hatred, delusion get put into the aggregate of formations. Also the good qualities like generosity, loving kindness, wisdom get put into the aggregate of the mental formations. But the primary factor in the aggregate of formations is volition or intention. The Pali word is cetana. Okay, then the fifth aggregate, we would say, is the chief amongst the five aggregates. This is the aggregate of consciousness. In Pali, it's called vijnana. And this is the aggregate, the way I understand it. I take vijnana to be, maybe you can call it the light of awareness that illuminates each objective field corresponding to a particular sense faculty. So the Buddha analyzes or dissects the aggregate of consciousness into 6 types of consciousness. So we have, and they're named after the sense faculty based on which they arise. So we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mental consciousness. Now, to exemplify my meaning, the way I understand eye consciousness is the type of consciousness that arises based on the eye, and it sort of lights up the whole field of visible forms. So the reason I'm able to see forms is because first the eye faculty has to be functioning. If it were to be damaged so that I'm blind, then consciousness can't arise based on the eye. But if the eye is functioning normally, then eye consciousness arises based on the eye, and it illuminates the whole field of forms. So I can look into the far distance and see trees and hills, mountains. In the far distance, I can look up close and I can see this cup or this pen. I look out and I see all of the people in the class. So all of this field of visual perception is possible because eye consciousness illuminates that field. And then it's perception that picks out the particular features in the visible field as a kind of basis for identification. Then ear consciousness, we could say, illuminates, mixing metaphors, it opens up the whole field of sounds so that I can hear sounds in the distance. If a dog is barking, I can hear it. I can hear the echoing of my own voice. If I turn on the radio, I can hear the radio. Everything becomes possible. Hearing of any kind of sound through the ear because of the ear consciousness. And that's the case with the other 3 types of sense consciousness: nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness. But then there's the mind consciousness or mental consciousness, which, the way I see it, it has 2 main functions. One is that the mental consciousness illuminates, let's say the mental consciousness can extend to the objects of all of the other senses, that the mental consciousness is not trapped and confined to its one exclusive type of object, but the mental consciousness can extend to visible objects, to sounds, to taken odors, scents, taste, and so on. So if I have 2 shades of brown, it's the visual consciousness which takes them in, but it's the mental consciousness which relates these 2 shades of brown. In fact, there's even mental consciousness which enables me to know even one object as being brown. The eye consciousness just brings in the color, but the eye consciousness is like a camera. With the camera, you can take many pictures, but you ask the camera, what pictures did you take today? It doesn't know anything. You press the memory button on the camera and it'll bring back the pictures that you took. But it doesn't know anything. It just brings in the images. And that is what eye consciousness does. But it's the mind consciousness which starts to make sense out of the pictures, which starts to relate things to one another and to build up a kind of scheme or system of meanings, attributes, relationships. So that is one function of the mind consciousness. Maybe actually we should say 3 functions of the mind consciousness. The second would be to relate sensory impressions that come through the different senses, to relate them and coordinate them in order to build up the conception of one object. For example, I might have a red oval-shaped object in front of me, patches of green on it, little specks of yellow and green, with something that we'll call a stem coming out from the top. Then I take that and I bite into it and I get a particular taste, and then I coordinate that particular taste to that particular form. So if I see that form again, then I have a pretty good idea of what kind of taste to expect from that form. So what establishes a relationship between taste and forms, this is the work of the mental consciousness, or it's mental consciousness that makes that possible. Then the third function of the mental consciousness is to know its own distinct class of objects. The mental consciousness can know objects that have nothing to do with the senses. It knows abstract ideas. It deals with thoughts, reasoning, judgments, evaluations. All of this is, we could say, the functioning of the mind consciousness, the mental consciousness. Of course, in reasoning, reflection, evaluation, the mental consciousness will build upon the sensory input, but it can form many abstract concepts based on that sensory input and deal with them at their own level without constant reference to the senses. To illustrate this, I'd like to use an example of, suppose I take an empty bag, I hold it up, you see it's empty, then I have a bunch of oranges in front of me. I take 2 oranges, put them in the bag. I take another 2 oranges, put them in the bag. Then I open the bag and I take out the oranges, and there are 5 oranges. So you've seen empty bag, 2 oranges went in, another 2 oranges went in, 5 oranges come out. Do you conclude 2 plus 2 equals 5? Somebody does? I think you would conclude either that Bante's a magician, or that there was an orange hidden behind, in the back of the bag, or one of the oranges underwent binary fission when it was in the bag. But you don't conclude that 2 plus 2 equals 5, because we know this conceptually to be true. Okay, that's getting a little off track. Okay, so there he is. In brief, these are the 5 aggregates. And I have to again emphasize that these 5 aggregates, so we speak about them separately, but in actual life, they always function together as the kind of organic whole, unified whole. Okay, any questions on the 5 aggregates? Two, 3, okay. Okay, one question. When the Buddha declares not I am is the Pali word, the negation of Sakkaya. No, it's not the negation of Sakkaya, it's the negation of the word I am, which is eso amust me. And so it said, I am not this, neso amust me. 2. Okay, I always thought of the aggregate of sankhara as including our emotions, but emotions don't really feel volitional to me. Is this where emotions belong or not? I think we could say that what we call emotions are probably, from a Buddhist standpoint, complex phenomena which involve primarily a component from the aggregate of volitional formations and a component from the aggregate of feeling, mixed, working together. So certain emotions, let us say anger. Okay, anger is an emotion. Actually, anger would be would be part of the volitional formations. Even though, as I said, in the narrow sense, the sankhara khanda is identified with volition. But the Buddhist texts use the sankhara khanda to include many other mental factors. So many factors that we would call emotions come in the sankhara khanda as the volitional formations or volitional activities. Even though they're not, what's prominent in them is not so much volition, but more the emotional aspect. So anger would be volition, anger would be an emotion, but it belongs to the volitional formations aggregate. Let us say love, in the sense of personal love, affectionate love, would also, I think, in my view, come into the aggregate of volitional formations.
Wouldn't emotions also have to have a component of recognition, except perhaps for the feeling of the uncanny? That is otherwise, for instance, you can't experience love without having a feeling, without recognizing what you're loving. Right? So you'd have to have that too, right?
It's been a long time since your 18th birthday. Yeah, but as I said, in emotion, several of these aggregates work together, but probably the volitional formations would be the dominant one. But also there will be feeling and recognition or perception. Did somebody take the microphone? Did you want to ask a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, then the third question here. Mental consciousness sounds like the mechanism for perception. I don't like to use the word mechanism because it suggests that mental processes are mechanical, which they're not. But I say that there's a very close connection between the mental consciousness and perception. Since perception is what picks up on the qualities of objects, then it's the mind consciousness, mental consciousness that uses these qualities as a basis for classification, conceptualization, comparisons, establishing relationships. And so yes, they're very closely related. question, can perception be explained as the abstraction or picking out of the major characteristics of a perceived object? Is this how memory works? Yeah, I think that just agrees with what I said. I said that perception is what picks out or selects the most salient or distinctive characteristics of the object perceived. And then that serves as the basis for, first for identification, and then based on identification, recognition can take place, or memory takes place. Okay, let us go on to the next question in the sutta. Okay, now one point that I want to make, very important point, and that is that the Buddha speaks of Sakkaya, personal identity, as being the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. And what else does the Buddha identify with the 5 aggregates subject to clinging? You've come across it. Where have you come across 5 aggregates subject to clinging before?
Dukkha.
Exactly. Dukkha, or the first in the formula for the 4 Noble Truths. So when the Buddha is explaining what is the noble truth of dukkha, the noble truth of suffering, then he says birth is suffering, old age, sickness, death, not to get what one wants is suffering. Then in brief, or in short, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are dukkha. And the reason, it's not that the 5 aggregates are always painful or miserable, but because they're all impermanent, conditioned, and so they don't satisfy the desire or need for something which is unshakable, let's say an unshakable, invulnerable basis for happiness. And so they're all considered dukkha. Okay, so now in the next question, Visakha asks Dhammadinna, he says, lady, it's said the origin of identity. The origin of identity. What is called the origin of identity by the Blessed One? Then Dhammadinna replies, it is craving which brings renewal of being, which is accompanied by delight and lust, which delights in this and that is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for being or craving for new existence, and craving for non-being, craving for annihilation. This is called the origin of identity by the Blessed One. So here, Visakha is asking, how is it that this compound of the 5 aggregates that makes up our identity, how does this come into being? How does this originate? And then Visakha answers that it is craving that brings it into being. But it might seem, sort of to common sense, well, craving is part of the 5 aggregates. So how can the 5 aggregates arise from craving, which is in the 5 aggregates? How can it do that?
Well, according to dependent origination, craving leads to clinging, or upadana,
Yeah.
which leads to bhava,
Yeah.
becoming, which then conditions birth.
Yeah.
And death, and the whole...
Okay.
How do you pronounce it? Jaram, Marani? I can never...
Jara, yeah, Jara is one word.
Jara.
Marana is...
Marana.
Yeah, Jara, Marana.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's actually the craving from the previous existence. Insofar as that craving still remains intact from the previous life, that craving becomes the powerful force which it's still seeking. It's seeking delight, seeking pleasure, enjoyment, and so that craving, when the old body perishes, then the stream of consciousness is still housing, is still accommodating that craving. And so that craving, together with ignorance, together with the karmic formations, builds up the next existence. It's the craving that drives the stream of consciousness into a new form of existence. In the case of a human birth, it will drive it into the mother's womb to link up with a fertilized ovum, and then that will bring the beginning of the fetal development until eventually the child is born and comes out into the world. And so this is how craving, say, constructs, builds up, fashions, fabricates, creates, originates a new existence in the future. And so, once this new life comes into being, one goes through a lot of experiences, a lot of actions, always driven by craving to find some kind of satisfaction, to find delight, pleasure, to satisfy one's cravings. And then as long as that craving is not extinguished, does not yet come to an end, when death takes place, that craving will build up still another existence. And this is how the round of birth and death keeps going from one life to the next, to the next.